So we are here with an incredible person, uh, Vanessa Westley,
Mhm.
who has done very unique work in the communities and throughout Chicago, not just Chicago, but throughout the United States. And as we began to really think about how do we use assets in lieu of the police, what assets are already there in our communities, I find this conversation to be an interesting one because I'm speaking with a person who's a police officer and an incredible police officer at that. And so, first, why don't you introduce yourself, Vanessa? Who are you?
Sure.
And
It
tell us,
depends
share a little bit.
on what day you're asking me. So today, who am I? My name is Vanessa Westley. I am a Chicago police officer, now 29 years, about 9 months and a few days. Came on the job in 1991, and I've done everything that I think I could do during that time span in my early years. But I fell into my heart work when I had an opportunity under then interim superintendent and first deputy Dana Starks to really look at the nuances of what I had learned to be community policing. What did it take to be authentic? So, and that was about 16 years ago in my career, and I began to see the heart of what I don't call it public safety, but community safety, safer neighborhoods. So currently, right now, I am the program director and training coordinator for the Office of Restorative Justice Strategy that is under the community policing umbrella for the department. And that comes with a myriad of things. But what's most important is building the relationships needed to create safer neighborhoods, where I have the fortunate pleasure and honor to actually implement the concepts of ABCD. But for us, it's not so much as community development, but it's community engagement. So I am one of the few last remaining certified instructors to continue to train in that model. Conceptually, we as a department have embraced that alongside of the tenets of community policing because you cannot have effective community policing without intentional and integral community engagement. And that's what we use the ABCD model to do. So that's
And,
kind of a little bit who I am.
uh, and, and that's just a little bit, because I know you're so much more. Um, well, what makes, there's been community policing history in almost every city, and what makes what you do so unique, and what makes it effective?
Mm.
And I think too, how do you build? You mentioned authentic relationships. How do you do that in communities that don't trust police in particular?
Well, I have to say you have to keep at it, first of all. It's not an easy. You just don't, like any relationship, that first date is very important, just as important as that fifth or that last date, right? So, what makes Chicago unique, period, is just the makeup of the city. We have like 77 little cities within this large city and a myriad of cultures and the way things are working, how things work, how community exists. And one of the nuances of being a Chicago police officer is that I can be assigned anywhere. You can be assigned anywhere. So understanding the value of the culture and nuance where you work makes your job easier. I won't say exactly easy, but it makes it more palatable. It makes it more authentic, and your success rate goes up if you understand where you're working and the concept. So, what makes us successful is that we honor the neighborhoods that we go into. Once you understand conceptually what asset based community engagement is, you realize it as more of a tool in your tool belt to make as a professional law enforcement agent, but you also realize the importance of community capacity building. Unfortunately, the culture of law enforcement is that you have to know all the answers, right? You have to be able to solve the problem, whether you know how or not. What this process or what this foundation has done for us to realizing the value that's already there, and that you can't necessarily under the name of law enforcement really go in and create safer communities without the communities that you're working with. So you find out, and in doing that, you realize the value of the people that are there. And I think that is the turning point. That is one of the aha moments for many law enforcement agents, officers who are in community. Once they understand, oh, an asset. So that could be the grandmother down the street. It can be the business owner around the corner. It could be the pastor in the church. It can be the neighborhood watch person, right? So you're bringing value, and bringing that value, there's a different type of approach and perception. So I think the successes of that is that you realize that the strength of community safety, which means it's everybody's responsibility, lies with the people that we're trying to keep safe. Then, because we are in this space only a certain amount of time. And we find that as we continue to build capacity and honoring that value and those assets, then the strategies of quote unquote policing start to differ from the strategies of community safety. And I think our successes have lie now in collective community safety.
Can you talk a little bit about, or give me an example of how that worked for you personally?
Well, for me personally, I have incredible stories. It started when I was first in community policing, and I had a commander that told me to go and do a Saturday event. It was go get the basketball rims and go put them up on the block, because the more mature, the older residents on the block were complaining about the younger kids. They had a couple of about four young families to move into the block, and they had smaller children. So of course you had that generational gap that had to be addressed. But then it became a nuisance and a disturbance. Therefore, it became a police problem. So I did that. I went over there and I set up a bunch of rims. I had a DJ, I had the hot dogs flowing and all that. Come to find out that they came, they got the hot dogs and they disappeared. There was nobody there. And what I didn't realize was the assets on the block, or the value of the block, was to have that conversation. What was really going on? Culturally, for law enforcement, we go in and we have to address the first thing that we see, and oftentimes we miss it. So my personal experience was when I eventually realized that I had to go sit on the porch and really find out what was going on and approach and engage the young people that was considered the problem. I realized there weren't aspiring basketball players; there were aspiring fashion designers.
Mm.
And what I had gotten was I was looking for a bunch of young boys playing in the alley, disturbing the older people, and there was a bunch of young girls trying to figure out what to do during
Mm.
the summer because they couldn't go to the park because it wasn't safe. So that particular summer, we went from basketball rims to a runway in the middle of the street. And we found that there were women on the block, mothers that was so seamstress. We had quilters on the block.
Mhm.
So these young women sat with these older women and they began to design their dresses for the fashion show later that summer. So what didn't exist was the relationship between the young people and the older people, because they just didn't talk. They couldn't find their common interest. But when they did find it, there was no need for them to call the police because they had the relationship to resolve whatever the concerns were. So that taught me a lot about going in headstrong with what I think should happen without without assessing what's already there.
Could then, what was the magic? I think you said it, but we all know that that's a process, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you talk about the process a little bit?
Well, for me, because this was like what the small scale incident grew into is what we do now on a larger scale. Ensuring that we're able to engage people around their change and the processes to change. For me, that particular incident was actually having a conversation with the elders on the block, and then sitting down and getting to know the young people that were identified as the issue. because there was only one voice heard on the block, and that was the ones who had called the commander at the
Mm,
time. And then to understand, the stories and the narratives that were living behind those doors in those houses.
mm,
That no, we don't have aspiring athletes, but we have fashion designers. And once someone actually listened to them and the things that they were concerned about, like we can't go to the park because there's a gang war. Um, we're tired of sitting in the house, and we're talking about fifth grade to fifth to maybe freshman in high school. So the dynamics were there to create processes of communication that weren't there.
mhm,
And that took me having to have understanding that there were some things they could do. We had seamstresses on the block. I didn't have to make it up. There was a learning opportunity. There was a generational gap that was closed. So it took the process of identifying people and acknowledging their value, if I could say it that way. And I wouldn't have taken the time to do that if I didn't understand asset mapping.
I guess what I'm also getting to is that they're having this conversation with a police officer,
Yes.
which is a little different. Usually those conversations, in a lot of our communities are not the best. So how do they trust you?
I was honest. Um,
What does honesty look like?
for me, it's telling the truth. And I was actually transparent, meaning that I wasn't there to cause any harm, or I didn't. My first inkling was not to arrest anybody or punish anybody.
Okay.
My first inkling was to, provide a service. So I came under with the intention of serving, and realizing that it took more than just me doing something. It's in that serving I had to honor what was there
Mm,
and work what was there, and that, my grand ideas may not have been the answer to resolution. So started out with a one-on-one, a couple one-on-ones. It started out with constant, engagement. I just didn't go over there one day and jump up and do it. I had to go over there a couple of times and to understand the narrative.
mm,
And then, brainstorming. What can we do now together that we couldn't do separately?
mm,
And that was my process. So it started out with one conversation, and it grew to another, and grew to a mutual respect. And then we all put our hands to it and said, well, why don't we do this? So the process, although it seemed like it felt really simple, but it was a lot of braiding of relationships and community building that didn't exist on that block. Unfortunately, in some marginalized communities, people stay in their houses.
mhm,
The seniors were afraid to engage the young people because they saw them as a problem.
mhm.
Right. So now the seniors see the values, and then the younger people began to see the seniors differently because they taught them how to sew, and then they were affirming things. So there were so many things that happened in that small window that began to happen without me.
Mhm.
And I think that's the continuation of the process. I didn't go over there to tie something to me. I went there, one, to just answer a call. And what I learned to do is to honor the value of the gifts that are there, whatever they are.
So what about your colleagues? Did they did they feel the same way? And
Well,
I mean, imagine, it wasn't just you. So how did you get
no,
others to?
no. I relied on my relationships, and I drove a whole lot of people with me on game day. So, but I think the proof and the change was what they saw.
Mm,
I think, so much of my career, I rely on what I know, and that's cuffs and systematic processing. If I cannot resolve it, then, the worst case scenario or the last case scenario is the arresting, or, the sanction, or, things that unfortunately in most struggling and challenged neighborhoods they've become used to. So when an officer sees there's another way for it to work, and the success out of it, then they're more likely to try it or begin to trust it. When it comes to my colleagues and the community, it's like it's like you're really walking a fine tightrope because there's so many differing or diverse parts of the spectrum. Um, but we all meet when it comes to wanting safer spaces. The police, because that's what we feel that we've been called to do, create safer neighborhoods and protect the the ones who are being taken advantage of. And then the residents want to live in a space where they are they can feel safe, they can have the quality of life that they intended to have. So, but getting those folks or bringing them to the table is not as easy, but it's not impossible. So, my colleagues in that particular instance, there wasn't a lot of them because this is really small scale, right? This is one block in a neighborhood of many, and the attention comes to that when it bleeds, it reads. When you have people focusing on those priorities, this non-violent, non first priority crime kind of situation takes a back seat.
Right.
So I was able to influence about a handful of my colleagues to help just, because it became automatic. The neighborhood took it over and I was there to support. But they got to see something different and it's really a sigh of relief when you can see you're not riding on a call where somebody's, hurt, harmed, dead. Um, but as programming and the things that I've been involved with between that time and now, I've, had an opportunity to influence a lot of thinking around valuing the places. And I use the word value not haphazardly, but intentionally, because we respond to things different that we value. So the honor or the opportunity where I'm okay with not having the answers, but really honoring the people who do, and that's the people who live there.
So I know we mentioned sacred spaces, and I know that you are pretty well known to set up spaces throughout the city with police officers and community people,
Mm.
right? Sitting in circle. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I fell into restorative justice. I did not pursue. I pursued it after I fell in it. We were presented with the problem of trust from our younger community, our community of youth. Um, when we were approached by then the YMCA Youth Safety and Prevention Unit and Youth Violence Prevention. Yeah, Youth Safety Violence Prevention. And they had a group of young people that they were working that were just as involved. And they were trying to mentor them and help them make better decisions. They had all been incarcerated at one point or the other. And the question came up, do you go back to the street organization life or do you, pursue a different lifestyle so your days may be longer? And when presented with the issue, well, when the gays come after me, I'm afraid I have to live in these neighborhoods. My family have to live in these neighborhoods. It's not that easy to make that choice. One of the directors said, well, why don't you call the police and let them help you? Oh, no, they're the worst gang of all. And what the challenge was, how do you serve people who don't trust you?
Mm.
So with that, the design of the process came to be known as Bridging and Divide, where we use the circle process to really heal a lot of that dysfunction. For officers to look differently at the young people that they serve instead of the problem, but the potential. And then young people to speak their truth, both young people and officers to speak their truth without judgment, because within the restorative space, there is no hierarchy and everybody's voice have value. They're respected. And as you are want to be respected. And so those are places that both of these two communities, frontline officers and young people, basically young Black men, had never had that opportunity to have people look at them, listen to them. And people heal differently when they're heard. So what ended up happening is that anybody who sat in circle is that collective wisdom and that connectivity began to create bonds of It was a sacred space where all everything was outside of it, and most of these officers and young people had never had that trusting space. So when we were able to create it together, then you saw parts of relationships that were broken, that were being restored for whatever the reason was. We had apologies from both young people and officers. So all those things that hurt us so much will begin to be were developed. And what we found was that young people saw a side of police officers that they had not. And the basketball games are fine. The all that stuff is great. Those events are great, but a space created especially to deal with the matters of pain and healing. And it was hard to get our officers in that because that's not how we roll. But when they did connect, they connect now. I mean, they're still connected now. So restorative justice for me and for our unit and how we got to be restorative strategies with that was we were able to do stuff that systematic processes could not. You could not build those relationships incarcerating people. I mean, and yes, there are times that has to happen, but what are the times that they're not? So it went from being with just young people to adults, right? These kids would go and tell their parents, I sat in circle with so and so and officer this and officer that, or if they're on the street and they're with their families, they're not shameful of acknowledging that relationship. So bridging the divide embraced the restorative practice of circle and peace circle making. It introduced to the department public participatory dialogue because once now I have a relationship, now let's talk about what we need to do to co-create safer neighborhoods. And what we have developed over the last 2 years is this authentic platform for youth voice, not a social activity driven group Saturday morning type thing. We have young people who are concerned and really concerned about the health and wellness of their communities, especially in the public safety space. Yes, they're concerned about what happens when they're stopped and how they're treated. That's a huge concern. But they're also concerned about their grandmothers can't go to the grocery store. They're concerned about the lights being off on their block. They're concerned about their siblings, their younger siblings, having to walk to school or walk from school or have a playground to play in. And they want to do something to change it, but they can't do it on their own. So the conversations that you spoke about bringing police officers and community, especially community youth, we create the circle process gave equity in those voices where young people felt that that was their space too. And that's why we used it. Police officers felt the sanctity of being able to speak to what they were concerned about without being judged as well. And that's what grew our processes. And that's how we're able to continue to bring community and those who work in law enforcement uh, together around things of concern.
Could could you give me an example um, of how it worked? Because you gave me how it's designed and
hmm
what would an outcome look like, and what have you seen as an outcome?
Well, John, community engagement and relationships are not quantitative
Yeah,
statistics. So the bean counters miss out, right? That means you have to
right,
listen to the narratives and the stories.
right.
So I would tell you an outcome was when I had a group of young people that I think one of your guests already with Kids Off the Block and Diane Latiker.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she gave us an opportunity to have not one, not two, but three cohorts
Mm-hmm.
with the young people she served. And we're not talking about young people who have it easy. These were young people who adamantly will not engage with the police. But she gave us a place of safety. And we even helped by making sure that we didn't park squad cars around. They parked around the corner. They made sure that they were able to conceal the uniform. But the outcome from that is that I believe we had young people who still would speak to those officers that normally they would throw bricks at the car.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that relationship, there was some wisdom that was exchanged about school, about sports, about staying out of trouble, understanding the criminal justice system that they wouldn't have ordinarily got because they could sit and have real life conversations. They learned about who were heroes and who were not. They, our officers shared stories, about them growing up. And it's out of that dynamic of storytelling that people learned. So if I was to give an outcome to that cohort alone, the relationships of beats 531, 532, 533, which are generally about 9 to 15 officers, and those young people who live between 115th, 123rd from state to maybe prairie had a different dynamic, and they enjoyed that dynamic. I had officers going playing basketball on their off time just to go, just to say, hey, I said, they made commitments. Look, I told you I was going to come help you with your jump shot. I'm on my way, right? Unheard of. And this is when I describe the outcome, healing took place, understanding was established, and rehumanization occurred. And I'm not sure how you can define that statistically. Um, I do know that some of those relationships are still intact, but the very dynamics of of law enforcement and the assignment and the logistics, many of those officers that worked in that community don't work there any longer. So I couldn't go back. I don't know, maybe one or two that still have a relationship contact with Diane and some of those young people. Most of those young people have aged out of the program as well. um, but to that end, that's what I would call an outcome. Many of those young people had very serious lives, and they didn't see the police as the ops anymore. They found another source or resource of help.
Can you
Uh,
talk about, you said something, rehumanization. What does that mean?
so in my whole career, up until these last 10 years, it's always been the us versus them. It was the good guys versus the bad guys. The police were the good guys, and everybody that was breaking the law were the bad guys, right? People who hurt people. And after a while of seeing the bad of anybody, you think that's all that exists. And I think um, when I say rehumanization, I think about how young people and how our residents actually think of who we are. And you think we're these robots that just go around and put handcuffs on people and harass folks. And that's not the case. So it still amazes me even now, the young people will ask me, you have kids? You go to the grocery store? What vacation? They think that you eat, sleep, and breathe that blue uniform. And then the officers think that all these young people do is dread their hair, um, and wear their pants sagging. They don't even know a bunch of them go to church. They don't know that they have like 3.0 GPAs because they never got that far. So the rehumanization that I'm speaking of comes with the dialogue and the time necessary to see past the facade and see the humans that we are. The best part of me that's in the best part of you.
Thank you. A couple more questions. Uh,
Sure.
what would you say your gift is?
Wow. Oh, let's see. I am a convener.
Mm,
I think I, and all the things that comes with that. I see the value of the collective. Um, A, B, C, D helped me to see the value of the collective, that no one person needs to do it all. So to be able to create those convening spaces um, that allow people to see themselves in each other and benefit from the wisdom that they bring together to see the life that they want, I think that's my gift, and holding those spaces safely.
I think you answered my last question. I was thinking, I was going to ask, what did you want people to take away?
Whew, the power of the human spirit.
Hmm. What is
I,
that?
for me, we have gotten, especially in Western society and Western civilization, we have become socially dependent on infrastructures that we created that's supposed to serve us, but now they are dictating and living our lives and asking what's best for us. Um, I would love for us to go back to our nature. I love for us to look at who we are and the power that we have together and how we are better together than we are separate. So walking away from this conversation is believing in who you were originally created to be
Mm,
and who you are in the neighborhoods where you reside. That's where you show up. Where you work, that's where you show up. And be confident in the power in that. Your voice not only matters, is needful and necessary.